Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is left untalked about. It is May 4th. I am Ness here with Jeff, and today we're going to talk about several different things. We're going to start with an observation, a meta-observation about politics and culture in America with some polling data to back it up. And that is, despite hopes from the so-called dirtbag left that there might be some unification among the populist left and the populist right, the reality is that all the dissident energy in America is on the right side of the political spectrum. From a YouGov Economist survey, a couple of them we'll be pulling from that have been conducted in mid and late April, we see that the Democrats love their establishment figures and the Republicans largely despise their own. Net favorability. So we take the percentage of respondents who view a person as favorable, view them favorably, and then subtract from that the percentages who view them unfavorably. For Mitch McConnell, among Republicans, the favorability is a negative 26. So Republicans, this is not all respondents, but self-identified Republicans, have a very negative view towards Mitch McConnell, who, as the Senate Minority Leader, is perhaps the most officially powerful Republican in the country. Chuck Schumer, on the other hand, who is every bit as establishment and longstanding a Senate member as Mitch McConnell, has a plus 37 rating among Democrats. So there's a net difference of 63 points between Republicans and how much they despise Mitch McConnell and Democrats and how much they love Chuck Schumer. In the House, the dynamic is similar, not quite as pronounced, although it will be in time. Mike Johnson, as of the end of April, had a plus 12 rating among Republicans. But just 2 weeks ago, it was a plus 22. So you can see that shifting in real time as his views that he espoused before becoming Speaker of the House were pretty popular among the Republican base. But as he's become absorbed and become really a foot soldier for the establishment, his favorability is slipping, and I expect it will continue to do so until, I wouldn't be surprised if in less than a month he's in negative territory among Republicans like Mitch McConnell is currently. Whereas Hakeem Jeffries is at a plus 42 among Democrats. So Mike Johnson at a plus 12 among Republicans, Hakeem Jeffries at a plus 42 among Democrats. So that's a net difference of 30 points. And so the take-home message there is that whatever gripes and grievances Democrats might allegedly have against, quote, Genocide Joe, unquote, there is really no opposition at all on the left against the Democratic establishment, whereas on the right, among Republicans, being associated with the establishment has the benefits that accrue to it in terms of institutional power and prestige and respect, but in terms of electoral support, it is a devil's bargain where any Republican who's perceived to be part of the power structure rapidly loses support among Republican voters. Shifting a bit to another meta point, this time about the utility of polling, YouGov Economist took an interesting approach to a question about abortion in one of the April surveys that it conducted, where they split the respondent pool into two randomly assigned groups and asked the same question but worded it in a slightly different way. And the differences in responses speak to how the utility of polling is limited primarily, I would argue, to behavioral related questions and not so much in terms of sentiment. People will tell you what they're going to do, but in terms of how they feel, that's going to be something that is highly susceptible to being led. With that brief preface out of the way, the two questions were, first, would you support or oppose Congress passing a law banning abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy? The second question was, would you support or oppose Congress passing a law to limit abortion to the first 15 weeks of pregnancy? So applying a little bit of logic, you can see that those questions are asking the exact same thing. Either ban abortion after 15 weeks or only allow abortion up until 15 weeks, at which point it would be subsequently banned. And though the samples were randomly assigned, 48% of respondents favored a ban after 15 weeks, whereas only 36% supported limiting abortion to the first 15 weeks. And the sample sizes in both cases were over 800, so you're looking at a margin of error without going through the statistical analysis that's going to be on the order of 3 or 4%, and yet the difference there is a 12% swing, so it's well outside the margin of error, and it's contingent upon how the questions are asked. I could do a little bit of psychological speculation as to why there is a difference between those two, but perhaps it's the idea of limiting what a woman is able to do, that word limit, after a specific period of time. Although ban doesn't have a very positive connotation either, it does imply that there would be a right to an abortion trimester of pregnancy. And perhaps trying to speculate on the reason for the difference is a bit of a fool's errand, since again it's by definition not logical that there would be that significant difference between responses to something that's asking the exact same thing. And incidentally, to the extent that something approaching a consensus or at least a majority opinion can be reached among the populace when the question of abortion is raised, it is interesting to point out that this is like the King Solomon answer. I mean, whatever your position is on abortion, from a moral standpoint, this arbitrary cutoff at 15 weeks seems heinous from just about anybody's view, because if life begins at conception or at the introduction of a heartbeat, well, then you're well into the development level of destroying a life. And yet if there's nothing wrong with abortion, then why would there be any favorability towards arbitrarily cutting it off at 15 weeks, but not allowing it to go to 20 weeks or 25 weeks. And so morally, the more extreme positions are coherent, whereas this arbitrary marking at 15 weeks seems like it slices the baby in half quite literally, and should leave no one satisfied morally. I suppose this is a big problem with democracy writ large. As a polling respecter, I do want to again underscore that the lack of reliability in polling is limited to questions like this that are nuanced and that open themselves up to sentimental interpretation. If the question was, are you going to vote for Donald Trump or are you going to vote for Joe Biden, the percentage responses would add up to the same response percentages that we would get if we took those samples and just asked them in a head-to-head, who would you vote for, as opposed to a yes or no question. So again, I think if it's behavioral in nature, then the polling questions are going to be quite reliable. But if the question tries to gauge respondent sentiment, then it's going to be much more contingent upon the wording and more subject to manipulation by the institution conducting the polling in the first place. Pivoting again, also this week, Stone Toss had a pretty perspicacious comic. It's just a two-frame cartoon with expletive white people and a group of melanin-enhanced individuals, and then one white individual with a conspicuous yarmulke marching together, and then that's in the first frame, so it's F white people, and then in the second frame it is the Jewish Ashkenazi, presumably because he's white, turning and looking at an angry mob of non-whites that he had been marching with, looking at him. And I think that really gets to the crux of what is going on with the Palestine, or the Israeli occupation or attack against Palestine, against Hamas, against Rafah, against the broader Arab world, for the West. And that question is, are European descended Jews going to increasingly come to perceive themselves, or be forced to perceive themselves, in the same bucket with the same fate and the same consequences and cultural ramifications as Gentile whites are in the West? If Jews don't want to identify themselves as white, but non-whites do, and non-whites increasingly are becoming larger minorities or majorities in historically Western European descended countries, well, does it really matter what whites think. Firstly, that's more a rhetorical question because in surveys, Ashkenazi Jews do consistently regard themselves racially to be white. In the general social survey, the percentage of Jewish respondents who racially identify as white is over 90%, for example. And so the reality is that Judaism is by far the whitest religion in the United States. It's even whiter than Mormonism, let alone any other denomination of Christianity or Islam or Buddhism. We're seeing the fault lines on that question come into stark relief with the pictures of the, quote, frat boys, unquote, the white Southern kids, some percentage of who are Ashkenazi, some who are surely just good old Gentile Southern white boys, standing around or guarding an American flag amidst the American and Israeli flag amidst the protests that have roiled several campuses across the United States over the last few weeks. In response to the image at UNC going viral, Bill Ackman, so a Democratic Jew, for a wealthy leftist Democratic Jew for all his life, conspicuously donated $10,000 to a bunch of Southern white, mostly Gentiles, supporting the American flag, dressed in the khaki and polo shirt type attire. So the optics of that are seismic in terms of what it potentially entails for the shifting cultural and political landscape in America. That is something that would be really inconceivable even 5 years ago. And now I think that we might be seeing, as we've noted here on the Reality Taboo previously, specifically with regards to Bill Ackman, because I think he's the most prominent person with the resources and the influence behind him to move and shake in the landscape. I think he's one to watch, and here he's signaling clearly where I think a lot of the sentiments of the wealthy, cultural, creating Jewish power structure may be feeling out of necessity that it has to move.
So, Ness, you're talking about an alliance between Jews and white Gentiles. Do you think the fact that America is becoming less religious overall will help that process of alliance?
Rationally, yes, that seems like it would make sense on the face of it. Of course, pushing back against that, a counterpoint would be that evangelicals, specifically regular church attending, pious, more fundamentalist evangelicals, are the largest block of Christian support for Jews in America now, but there is widespread support for an affinity towards Jews among whites, among Gentile whites, non-Jewish whites in America, irrespective of religious affiliation. It's really more the specific and explicit support for the state of Israel that is most pronounced among evangelicals. But generally speaking, Gentile whites, be they religious or not, take their cultural cues from influential Jewish cultural making institutions.
And there'd also have to be some maybe reduction in the animosity that Jews feel towards evangelicals, because as we discussed in last week's episode, there's Jews have a pretty low view of evangelicals.
I think one of the big questions will be, is this going to be the same type of inflection point that, say, 9/11 was, in terms of generating a lot of animosity towards the Islamic world among Westerners who up to that point were either indifferent or had a mild affinity for the Muslim world. And then that flipped really on a dime in the wake of 9/11. And so the question is, could October 7th be something comparable for Ashkenazi Jews in the West vis-a-vis Gentile whites, Gentile Europeans in the Western world?
What I think is more likely is going to be a repeat of what happened after 9/11. Well, not exactly a repeat, but some parallels. When after 9/11, the number of Muslim immigrants to the United States increased. And you're seeing a somewhat similar dynamic with, of course, predictably, there's talk of the Biden administration allowing in a certain number of Palestinian refugees to the United States. So just like Muslim terrorists attacked the United States at 9/11, and as a result, we increased immigration from Muslim countries, Hamas attacks Israel, which many consider basically the 51st state, so in a way an attack on America. And after Hamas Palestinian terrorists attack Israel, the number of Palestinian immigrants to the United States increases. So, Ness, are you saying that perhaps unlike after 9/11, when the Jewish power structure or whoever was in control of immigration, despite 9/11, allowed in more Muslim immigrants, are you saying that maybe Jewish people have learned their lesson from that experience and that they won't repeat that same thing by allowing in Palestinians after October 7th?
I think the question will be, does the Jewish power structure perceive Europeans as their biggest threat, which they certainly did after 9/11. They did not believe that Muslims from the Middle East were the biggest threat to Jewish well-being in the Western world. Quite the contrary. They looked at Muslims and really non-Europeans from all over the world as wreckers that would break up what they perceived to be a power structure, a Middle American power structure that was hostile to them, had been hostile to them and it's understandable because for 2,000 years it largely was hostile towards Jews, and there was a lot more power in the European world than there was after the fall, especially after the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the 20th century. But really, even going back 500 years prior to that, the Islamic world was not nearly as powerful as the Western world was, the European civilization. And so Jews have a long memory of European antagonism towards Jews. And that was certainly is still in play, and was certainly still in play after 9/11. I think that will be the question. Is that changing now? Is the perception that the global South is no longer so manageable as it was perceived to be, because the Middle American bulwark that was trying to be broken up by Jews, they overshot and broke it up too much, enfeebled it to too great an extent, to now we're in a situation where even when all the institutional power structures are trying to signal strongly that protests like these are unacceptable, that this criticism of Israel bleeds over too easily into criticism of Jews in general. And so that's a problem. And even with all the signals and the media attention and all of the talking points going out that are uniform really across both aisles in Congress, and also indistinguishable between, say, MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, even when all the signals are being sent out, there's still this seemingly incorrigible, we'll see if it lasts, resistance to what is being done in the Western world in support of Israel. If cultural kingmakers like Bill Ackman are perceiving it to be starting to spin out of control, it is at least conceivable. I don't think it's likely, but I think it's conceivable that there may be a radical shift, a radical recalculation, as Jews increasingly see their fates tied to that Middle America, or the Western remnant, the European strain of Westernism. It's not outside the realm of possibility that they could begin to perceive Western Gentiles vis-a-vis non-whites as they do Israelis vis-a-vis Palestinians specifically, and Arabs more generally. A sort of, if you can't beat them, join them situation.
A couple of my normie friends have noted the trying to figure out why there's been a pretty harsh response to the college protests. At least seems like the use of force is disproportionately high given the nature of the protests, which were largely peaceful, almost exclusively peaceful. Now, I think when the protesters at Columbia broke into, I think it was Hamilton Hall, actually broke windows and started occupying the hall and changed the name. I feel like that's the point when it really went past the tipping point. But even despite that, the response seems disproportionate, especially compared with 4 years ago, almost exactly 4 years ago, the BLM riots that were going on, where the destruction was, they were genuinely maybe not mostly, but significantly violent and destructive and sustained over weeks and spread out over the country. And we saw, who could forget those images of the police in Minnesota, the police essentially just giving up and surrendering the precinct. You saw police in some cases kneeling with the protesters. You saw politicians kneeling in Congress. You saw even Republicans like Mike Johnson expressing at least sympathy for what the protesters were trying to communicate. And of course, Tom Cotton famously advocated for sending in the National Guard to put down some of the BLM protests. So I guess kudos to him for at least being consistent, because he has called for the National Guard in both cases. But I think he's the exception. There has been much harsher, more stringent calls for use of force against the college protests.
The BLM riots served the institutions of power. These anti-Israel riots do not, at least among a significant portion, the majority of the power structure. As we've alluded to previously, there is an internecine conflict going on in the halls of power, the proverbial halls of power in the Western world, but it's not really an even civil war type of situation. There's a bit of an insurgency. Again, the sort of useful idiots that don't really get the message, that are kind of straying from it or taking the talking points too literally and trying to apply them universally when that's not how politics is played. That's not how cultural management is played. That's not how cultural control, that's not how power is wielded. Power is wielded by helping friends and hurting enemies, and there's some useful idiots who aren't getting that, and I think they're largely being put in their place now. But it is worth pointing out that there is more internecine fighting now than there was in the case of BLM, and that's why there is a restrained response, but still some sort of martial response to these college protests that largely was absent in the case of the BLM riots. But to step back and put this in broader context, if we're on a scale of like permissibility at a 100 on one end and at negative 100 on the other end in terms of impermissibility, well, maybe BLM was at like plus 95 in terms of permissibility, and these college protests now are maybe at like a plus 50. But if you compare those to, say, what happened in Charlottesville, which was just a one-off event that was not sustained, it was only existed for a couple of hours in 2017, it was like at a negative 100 in terms of how harsh the response was, the police response there, and the subsequent law enforcement response. And then again, looking at what happened after the election in 2020, the January 6th response was also much harsher than what, not in the immediate aftermath, because the incident itself was useful for the narrative, but in terms of the consequences for the J6 protesters, they are going to be more significant, substantially more significant, I presume, than what is going to happen to a lot of these college protesters, especially if the college protesters get the message and the protests dissipate, and I suspect that they will. Another thing is to stress the importance of location and being in friendly territory versus being in hostile territory. So we mentioned the BLM riots, and the reason I put that at a 95 permissibility as opposed to, say, 100% is that there were a couple places in the country where the BLM riots took place and were ruthlessly shut down. Lancaster, Pennsylvania is the one that sticks in my mind, and it's the one that I like to use as an example for people to understand how important it is to be among those who are sympathetic to you, especially if you're going to take public action. Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the county went by double digits for Trump, and in the city of Lancaster, which is the largest city in that county in Pennsylvania, there was a night of BLM protests, and the mayor the following day, or in response to those protests, arrested several of the protesters, and the following day announced that any other subsequent protests that arose would be met with an immediate martial response and arrests and full prosecution under the law against the protesters. And the protests literally lasted for just a single night, and then there were no more protests in Lancaster for the duration of the BLM movement. And I think that's relevant here too when we're talking about where these college protests are taking place, like Columbia, that's in Manhattan, in New York City, the most Jewish portion of probably the most Jewish area of the entire United States. And so it shouldn't be particularly surprising to see that the response to those protests were harsher there than they are anywhere else in the United States. Because just like in real estate, when it comes to culture and politics, location really is the most important thing.
And that internecine conflict you mentioned earlier among the elites regarding the college protests, I think has been ineptly shown by Biden, where he seems to be staggering or struggling to walk the line between maintaining both of his two of his most important constituencies, which are the left-wing progressive base and as well as his Jewish support. And although there's usually the overlap between those two, in this case there's quite a split. And interestingly, you saw Ilhan Omar appear at one of the campus protests. But now that I think about it, it's surprising that the members of the squad have been relatively muted on this issue. You see AOC maybe throw out a few kind of positive tweets towards the protest, but you would think people like Rashida Tlaib would be all over these protests and getting behind them, but I really haven't heard hardly anything from her.
I don't find this, maybe I'm overly cynical, I don't find that surprising at all. I mean, the power structure is just, despite, like we said, there's some internecine fighting, it's a junior party sort of acting out, and they're going to be reprimanded and put in their place. And these Congress critters who step out of line will not be free of the consequences. And so maybe they'll give a couple rhetorical sops here and there, but they know what side of the line they need to be on in this case. And so they're not going to step out of line.
So Rashida Tlaib, who is the only Palestinian member of the United States Congress, you would think if there were any issue that she would be willing to put everything on the line and actually take some real risk, it would be this issue. But again, you haven't seen or heard much from her. You would think you'd see her appearing at the protests and giving her full-throated support, but to my knowledge, she hasn't done so.
Yeah, I think that would be if you are naive and actually thought there was anything that people like her or anyone in the squad are going to stick their necks out for. As we mentioned earlier, on the left side of the political spectrum, such as it is in the United States, there is uniformity, there's conformity. You don't step out of line on the left and survive. That's why Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries have so much support, whereas on the right side, among Republicans, that's where all the dissident energy is, which is why you can't get, no matter what you try to do, you can't get the marshaled support for the Mitch McConnells of the world. And to the extent that they have goodwill, they burn through it rapidly when they join the establishment, as we're seeing in the case of Mike Johnson, who is quickly becoming one of the least popular Republicans in the country among Republicans.
And to your point, the few times that members of the squad do step out or go against the establishment, they do get reprimanded pretty quickly. I'm thinking of when Ilhan Omar, I don't know, a few years ago pointed out the in her opinion, the nefarious influence that Jewish organizations like AIPAC have on the United States Congress. I believe she was. So I just looked it up. It was actually a resolution passed in 2021 condemning and censuring Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and Ayanna Pressley. So I think that is the entirety of the squad. So they were condemned and censured for, quote, defending foreign terrorist organizations and inciting anti-Semitic attacks across the United States.
Yeah, the bitches were told to heal, and that's exactly what they did. And they'll continue to do so if they know what's good for them.
So, Ness, you mentioned before about the possibility, not necessarily the likelihood, but some sort of a paradigm shift in the way that Jewish Americans view important issues. Ness, you mentioned earlier about the possible paradigm shift among American Jews, perhaps an alliance between white Gentiles and American Jews, specifically on issues like immigration. And I wonder if the bill passed by the House recently, it is called, which I didn't realize it was called this, but it's titled Anti-Semitism Awareness Act of 2023. And this was actually introduced back on October 26, 2023. So obviously in reaction to the October 6th attack, but the bill had apparently been languishing. And as Rahm Emanuel said, never let a crisis go to waste. After the campus protests, it looked like that was the crisis that was not going to go to waste. And so the House passed that on, I believe it was May 2nd, and now it's sitting in the Senate. Presumably it will be passed by the Senate and signed into law by President Joe Biden. So just a brief summary of this bill I'm pulling from congress.gov. This bill provides statutory authority for the requirement that the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights take into consideration the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism when reviewing or investigating complaints of discrimination based on race, color, or national origin in programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance. According to the IHRA's working definition, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. And so some of the examples in the IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism are, the one that stood out to me was it would be presumed anti-Semitic to make the claim that an American Jew has more loyalty towards Israel than he does to the United States. And I don't think you have to be anti-Semitic to listen to Ben Shapiro, which I listen to him pretty regularly. I don't think it's a stretch or it's unfair at all to say that he cares more about Israel than he does America. And now I guess that would be, presumably, that would be anti-Semitic.
Could be, not necessarily would be, and I think that's the crux of the matter. I perceive this as as you alluded to, the Rahm Emanuel, the famous Rahm Emanuel quote about not letting a crisis go to waste. I think that was, hey, here's after October 7th, we have an opportunity to put more tools in our toolkit in terms of suppressing any sort of information that we don't like, and so we'll use that if we need to, but it will be administered very subjectively based on that familiar friend-enemy distinction. But the who-whom question will loom as large as it ever does. I can imagine a situation where, say, Ben Shapiro or someone comparable to him explicitly says that, hey, I do care about Israel more than I do about the United States. Well, if you're a news organization and you report that, are you going to be met with the weight of the law in response to doing that? I think that depends on who you are. I think if NPR is quoting some Jewish American who says that, then nothing's going to happen to them. But if, say, like Nick Fuentes brings it up, he might actually get a knock on his doorstep, proverbially or literally. But I don't think this legislation is evidence of a shifting in terms of the dynamic of how the power structure views the broader Western world and where the enemy and alliance lines lie. This bill was designed to give more power to the power structure as it currently exists. I think the manifestation of a shift in the orientation of the power structure vis-a-vis the demographic composition of the United States would be the allowing of Donald Trump to win the presidency in 2024, and then there be serious teeth behind some of the immigration restrictionist rhetoric that has been a cornerstone of his political career, and it actually being allowed to manifest itself in terms of stopping the invasion on the southern border and the construction of a physical barrier and the ending of visa applications from the Middle East and from other countries that are deemed to be hostile to the demographic stability of the Western world. If that sounds shocking and implausible, well, maybe it should, but I think if it is allowed to happen, then that will be a pretty good indication that a real shift has occurred in terms of the orientation of the power structure and the perception of people like Bill Ackman and the broader managerial power structure that he epitomizes. And at the risk of sounding a little spurgy, if this does take place, I wouldn't characterize it, as you did earlier, Jeff, necessarily as an alliance between heritage American Gentiles and Jews, as much as I would characterize it as the power structure getting behind the preferences and interests of Middle America, not for some magnanimous benefit of the Middle Americans that they presumably or putatively represent in a Democratic or Republican system, but by perceived necessity, born out of a realization that their fates are tied together.
We'll wrap it up there. Thanks for listening to The Reality Taboo. Please remember, like, share, subscribe. Talk with you next time.